Hey, what is up, everyone? Good morning. I am just checking on something really quickly. I am just hanging out. I've got a few minutes here, and I have no idea if anyone else is out there in the world. I usually do this stuff late at night. I just had a few minutes, and I just, surprise, surprise, wanted to talk about Star Wars. Uh, yeah, I don't know what to talk about entirely. There's still so many feelings I have coming off a video last week, I guess, with Matt Wilkins, a stream, the More Civilized Age podcast. I hadn't been on in a long time. I thought it was a really good conversation, but I sort of felt fired up. You know, it's really funny. I hadn't realized exactly sort of what we would be talking about until sort of like last minute. We talked a little bit about some of like what I think in the grand scheme, it's fairly sort of exciting news and sort of a series of exciting bits of news from the EU world, going back to the Titan collection of Star Wars Insider stories to Hasbro producing a bunch of new Legends figures. Interesting announcement from Del Rey that they're going to be sort of creating this new sort of Essential Legends collection, republishing some books under sort of a new kind of banner, and various other sorts of bits of news in the EU. It's funny. It felt a little insider baseball in some way, in the sense that it was a group of people sort of talking about some of the stuff at what's up the Penguin at a fairly sort of high level, so to speak, in the sense that we sort of like, I think some people were like missing some of the context, right? Because I look back and I go, God, I was coming off kind of critical. And I think and it's partially because it was like, we were just diving into it, right? You know, what are we feeling about these things? Like, well, implicitly, of course, we're all excited anytime there's EU news, you know. It's just that there's just some other things to sort of talk about, you know. But I was shocked about some of the comments, you know, sort of wondering whether, is this it? Are we done sort of fighting for Legends? And really nothing could be further from the truth, right? And I still have this long-term faith that we'll see some continuation in some way, despite the fact that, you know, Lucasfilm doesn't seem to be sort of hurrying to sort of make any decisions 7 years after the discontinuation in 2014. And again, particularly given that's what was so unfortunate about some of this news, right? Like with Hasbro, like messing up some of their figures and stuff like that, you know, like not understanding the names of the Legends figures that they're creating. And it just, you know, it takes some of the wind out of the sails, right? You know, unfortunately. But again, I think that a lot of the EU news we've seen recently is pretty positive, and I think that's worth sort of celebrating. So one thing that we were going to talk about on that stream, and just decided literally the last second, let's not do that. Let's talk about all this EU news. Was this question of what are bits of the EU that you thought would be bad that you ended up like really enjoying, or that ended up being really good? And that was a really difficult thing to think about. And I had a hard time coming up with lists, and partly because, and it's sad to say, but because it's been a while, right, since we've gotten a lot of new EU. And so it's hard to really remember like that far back, right? Like, what did I think about something before it came out? I just don't remember anymore. I struggled, and I came up with like a really general list, and I sort of thought, well, that's interesting. So here, let me see if I can share this here. So you don't want the E to continue on the current Lucasfilm, and I think that, and I totally respect that, and I understand that. I'm still slightly of the view. I'm still slightly in the camp of give me anything, and then let's see if it's good or not, right? You know, and I can recognize sort of the concern that like if something came out that wasn't good, or that, you know, that for whatever reason had something about Lucasfilm's prints on it that you didn't like, that you'd feel like it would be sort of maybe sullying the other EU. And I can totally appreciate that. I'm still in the camp of give us whatever you can give us, and we'll be the ones to determine whether or not we like it or not. I can appreciate that. I think that the one really substantial thing we've gotten post 2014, the Marvel 108 issue, I don't know if you've read it. I thought that there was a positive indication that we would be likely to get quality in continuity, not tinkered with content, right? And I think that was a good sign. Then again, that could just be the powers that be at Marvel, right? And so I think a lot of what it comes down to is like, how are the licensees going to handle the question of whatever sort of Lucasfilm interference like may or may not sort of come about. I mean, I think the thing to keep in mind is, unless you're talking about like shows and movies, Lucasfilm isn't going to be the one actually creating the content, right? It really comes down to licensees. So the unknown is, to what extent is Lucasfilm going to sort of tamper? And I'm reading between the lines, but I think often when people I think have made the determination that they don't want Lucasfilm to be involved in the continuation of the EU, it probably has something to do with their concern about like what sort of outside messages that they're going to sort of be forcing the licensees and authors to be sort of sticking into the content. I'm still not super concerned about that. Again, just given Marvel 108, it didn't seem like anything got shoved down our throats or whatever. It seemed like a high quality piece. But again, I can really respect that opinion. And I think that's what was so interesting about the conversation that I had last week with Matt in the stream, where we talked about some of this EU news and talked about how it was all good news. It's just that there were some things that took sort of the wind out of some of its sails, right? And I think for the first time since 2014, I moved slightly more in the camp of, now I'm getting concerned, right? And not so much for, I think, a lot of the reasons that some might argue, but again, simply because I'm like, geez, Hasbro can't even get the name of the figure right on the box, right? And isn't going to bother to like recall the packaging. So it's like, ooh, now that felt like the first sign to me of like, ooh, this is just kind of low quality, right? You know, so, but I can totally respect people's, you know, being skeptical, you know, to say the least. So here is my really uninteresting and very general sort of list of what are the things that, so you like, let's take a look at this. You like 108, the thing is it? Yep, no, it's true. I totally agree. Absolutely, absolutely. So, you know, it's right. I mean, and I get that. You know, I mean, again, I see 108 and I go, okay, didn't ruin it, right? 109 could suck, right? But I'm like, give it to us. Let's see, right? I'm fascinated by sort of the internal battles between the licensees and Lucasfilm, because the licensees are all desperate to give us, the consumers and the fans, more EU stuff, right? I mean, the Marvel editors love the EU. They had been pressing Lucasfilm for years to do something by way of continuing the EU comic storyline. And Lucasfilm really only relented when there was sort of this Marvel 80th anniversary sort of cover, right, for them to sort of say, well, here's like a sort of a one shot, right? And so I wouldn't be surprised, by the way, if there's some sort of notable like Del Rey anniversary, if we get some sort of short story or something continuing the EU, but only if Lucasfilm has sort of the cover to do that. So again, a lot of the stuff might be moot, right? We may never see more comics. We may never see more books. Who knows what form continuation might even come in. But yeah, again, I get it. You know, I get it. And I have to say too, after all these years of like defending Lucasfilm and wanting to work with Lucasfilm and its licensees to continue the EU, again, it's after 7 years, you have to sort of say, I still have long-term faith, but you know, you got to give me something, right? Otherwise, what the hell am I sort of waiting around for? You know, so. By the way, you know, at this point, and I've made this argument for a couple of years now, particularly given how long we've had to wait, and concerns that, like, for instance, like that you have and that many others have about like, would they ruin it or what would that look like, right? Two things. One, I've always argued that there are things within the established EU, the old EU, that suck, right? That aren't that great, but you appreciate it nonetheless for the value it makes or the contribution it makes just to the overall lore, right? So you may not like the way in which the author sort of like creatively, narratively sort of like told the story, but you still appreciate what you now know about that part of the Star Wars universe, right? In the way that, like, maybe bad analogy, but it's like maybe people don't like Hayden Christensen's acting, but surely we appreciate knowing more about like young Anakin, right? You know, but again, so I'd want to question what people exactly mean by sort of ruin it, right? And I think I have a sense, right? But there's a sense in which it's like, even if something sucks, it's still telling us more about, it's still continuing the story. You just hope it doesn't all suck, right? But I sort of feel like what I would want to see is maybe this is the way of splitting the difference. Maybe I don't even want stories anymore. Maybe what I want is for like Troy Denning simply to publish, you know, like an essay, like a nonfiction essay, just telling us what he would have done, right? Christy Goldman simply telling us, here's roughly where the story was going to go, right? And all that could just be like published on the StarWars.com website, you know, so at the minimum, just close some gaps in knowledge, right? That would be, I think, even more helpful than getting new content, costly new content that's going to potentially ruin the EU. Just have the authors who were going to write the old stuff tell us what they wanted to do, right? Totally agree with this. I think you nailed it. I think total missed opportunity not to satisfy the fans who want more Legends, and quite frankly also give us old fans who probably have all those old books like another reason to actually buy them, right? I mean, I'm a completist, right? I have it. I have it all, and for the first time, I'm thinking I probably won't pick these up because there's no reason to. They've got a new cover, but that's not lore. That doesn't tell me anything more about Star Wars, right? The only thing I'm vaguely interested in the new Del Rey announcement is the unabridged edition of Shatterpoint. That's kind of cool. That's new, at least, right? But yeah, totally missed opportunity to give us a little extra story. Totally agree. Or again, even related to my other idea, even just have like Matthew Stover come on, and it doesn't have to be a story, just like a page of content telling us something about his writing of the book or his insights into it. Just anything new for the old fans. So considering 108 doing well and republishing Legends, it saddens me that they're not considering publishing. Yeah, it's another great idea. And, you know, and what I like about all this is that this just goes to show there's an infinite number of, I think, good ideas out there, right? That there's nothing creatively sort of holding Lucasfilm back from, you know, finding an infinite number of ways of like satisfying the fandom, right? It would be so easy. Take the books that we know already exist that got canned and release them, like Escape from Dagu, right? It already exists. It even has the finished artwork. It got canceled because Del Rey only has so many licenses it gets from Lucasfilm to do stuff. They had to put one on the shelf for a variety of other reasons, but it's sitting there. Give Del Rey the license to put it out. Done, right? Like this, take short stories. Create an anthology, right? I think the coolest thing you could do is do like a version of the old Bantam era sort of tales from books, tales from the Republic, tales from the Empire, tales from Jabba's Palace, tales from Mos Eisley Canteen. Do the same sort of thing, right? And shore up all of this, right? Give us something called Tales from the Clone Wars that makes sense of all the contradictions, right? Tales from the Legacy era that bridges the gap between Crucible and Legacy comics. Tales from the Old Republic that tells us more about Darth Zana. I mean, there's a million ways of going, right? They're all good. And they're all better than getting nothing, right? You know, so let's see here. Okay, so here is just to go back. Here is my very general list of EU that I thought would be bad that I end up thinking was good. The first one is kind of not super obscure, but it doesn't get talked about a lot, but it's this series of Dark Horse digests. I think it's sort of known as the Star Wars Adventures. And I think there were 6. And I don't know that I thought they would be bad. I just sort of thought like, well, they won't be great. Some are really good. And there's one that I really like. And, you know, the name escapes me at the moment, but it's like with Luke and Yoda on Dagobah after he's first arrived, and it's him actually doing more training, right? Actually doing his Jedi training, you know, more than like the 3 minutes you see in the movie. So it fills in a lot of gaps. You realize, and it answers implicitly some important sort of fan questions about just because, and the Empire Strikes Back timeline is incredibly confusing, right? It's like, how does Luke spend all this time training to become a Jedi in apparently the same amount of time it takes the Millennium Falcon to get from here to Bespin, right? Like there's some timeline sort of challenges. And Pablo Hidalgo actually years ago spent some time sort of theorizing about this in some sort of interesting ways. But what's really neat about that little short sort of comic digest is that I think it came out like 2011, 12, I forget, 13, I mean, it's late. It just tells you some more about the story. It's a neat little tale, everything like that. So anyway, that I thought was good. That whole series is pretty good. And I think they've republished that. I think Dark Horse put out an entire omnibus of just those 6. Yeah, Tales of the Clone Wars, yeah. Oh, that's great. Tales of the Bounty Hunters. Yeah. Oh, I totally. I'd say just sort of. I don't know which of those Tales books I would single out as my favorite, but I sort of think collectively, those Bantam era Tales books, absolute sort of desert island Star Wars EU for me. If I had to grab just a small handful, in an emergency, those would be at top of the list. That's what it is. Yeah. Thank you. Yep. Yeah, it's funny. They're not super memorable, no, but I definitely think the Dagobah one is probably the most memorable. It's the one that always sort of sticks out. And I thought the whole thing would just be kind of silly and kind of kiddish. That one was cool. It was, and as I say, it sort of helps fill in some sort of important gaps. This is sort of general, but I remember when the Bantam era was coming to a close, and we were about to begin the New Jedi Order. And I remember distinctly actually seeing the television commercial for Vector Prime on TV and getting kind of geared up, but also kind of nervous because this was a big change. And it was clear that a big change was coming. It was also unclear to some of us at the time. You got to remember, this was like 2000-ish, so it's like, obviously we had the internet, we had a lot of these sort of great resources and stuff, but it wasn't like it was today, right? We had the Star Wars forums where people could, we had internet forums and stuff where people could sort of debate about this sort of thing, but it wasn't entirely clear. The proof was only going to be in the pudding and in the reading, right? To know whether or not it was really going to be connected to everything we had known about the EU, right? And so there was a certain amount of anxiety, trepidation about this new sort of series. It was clear that it was going to be darker. All of that ended up being true, but what was also great to know was that it actually was going to be in continuity and stuff like that, which it didn't necessarily sort of have to be, right? It was just another great instance in which the licensees and the authors and stuff proved just how much they respected Star Wars and the EU to keep it going in a contiguous sort of way. So that was really great to sort of see that pan out. When did I become an EU fan? What's my origin story? So I've talked about this before on Matt Wilkins' channel a long time ago. And it's not super interesting in the way I wish I had some moment where I remember it clicking. The thing is, I never remember not being a Star Wars and EU fan. And for me, I never saw the movies as somehow sort of like distinct from the books and the comics and things like that. So, I remember when like those early, like the Lando trilogy, and then a couple years later, things like following the Marvel comic run, and then in the sort of the early 80s with droids and Ewoks and things like that. I never saw this, for whatever reason, I never saw this as like, oh, this is sort of this tie-in to this movie that I really like. I was like, cool, this is just sort of more Star Wars. And so there was always this sense, I had sort of this, I kind of call it this like saga-centric perspective, right? It was never just these movies, oh, and let me go find the new books. It was just like, yeah, it was just more Star Wars. And so I remember, people often like look at 1991 with like the Throne, the Heir to the Empire, like as like the kind of the beginning of this new resurgence. I just remember being like, cool, it's another thing from Star Wars to pick up and things like that. So, I'm at the age where I sort of like, I took in the movies when they sort of came out and just kind of just kept up with it and never really sort of walked away. And so again, there's sort of the sense in which I guess my origin story is, I guess I was sort of born into Star Wars and born into the EU. So yeah, I still have all of my original sort of EU stuff from back when it came out, except sadly for my copy of Splinter the Mind's Eye, which I lost in a flood, I guess last year. So yeah, anyway, that's sort of my story. So I've been collecting ever since. And so a little bit like Matt Wilkins though, the really interesting thing about the difference between being sort of, in my opinion, like a Star Wars fan pre and post 2014 as an EU fan is that now you look back on the entire, expanse of the expanded universe, you're just like, I want everything, right? I want to know every little bit, right? And moreover, I want to be like fighting to get more, right? I want to be working with Lucasfilm. I want to prove to them that we're out here, we want more. That said, the interesting thing pre-2014, before there was an inclination like that this was all going to go away, is that, you could be a little choosier, right? I pretty much had a standing order for anything, so it's like if there was a new comic or a new book or a new role-playing game or whatever, right? I just get it. It was just more EU. I wanted to keep knowing where the story was going to go. But to be honest, like the like Old Republic stuff, I never like rushed to get. I would always be like, I'll get there, you know, I'll get there eventually, right? And partly because I'm not like a modern gamer. It's funny, sometimes this comes up where I'll say like I'm not a gamer, and then I sort of like immediately alienate myself from like a vast majority of not only Star Wars fans, but like modern pop culture. And when I say that, it really means like I just, for a variety of factors, just never got into sort of like the modern RPG video games and stuff like that. Interestingly enough, though, I was like right on the scene with like the early 80s, like old things like Commodore 64, Death Star games and stuff like that. So like the old Star Wars arcade games, really early, you know, first generation sort of like console games with Star Wars and stuff, love that stuff, whatever. But yeah, it's funny, like Old Republic, I would eventually get there. And then again, ironically now it's like, if all we got was Old Republic stuff from, you know, from a continuation of the EU, I'd be all over it, right? So it's really funny. You had the freedom and the luxury to sort of kind of pick and choose which eras you like, right? And now, if someone asks me my favorite era, I'm like, well, it's all one thing, right? You know, it's just the EU, it's just the EU. So that's my long answer to the origin story. So here's another answer to the question of what did I think was going to be bad that ended up being good. So I've made my views pretty clear, I think, about the Filoni Clone Wars, which is that I think they're kind of a mess, and unnecessarily so, and that there's been a movement in the fandom since 2008, which even Leland Shee recognized as early as 2008, to help make sense of the Filoni Clone Wars in the context of the EU, and we continue to try and hold him and Lucasfilm to their promise to one day eventually give us a retcon to make sense of how it fits in the context of the larger saga. So again, I'm not a huge fan of it. It actually slightly alienated me. I didn't think it was for me. I very, very briefly walked away from Star Wars after the first season. It just wasn't for me. I appreciated the way, I could see at conventions, I appreciated the way that it was resonating with very young kids. And I thought, okay, if this is their gateway into Star Wars, that's great. Let's just make sure they get all the good stuff. So it was kind of a mixed bag. I do like parts of it, you know, but yeah. So that's sort of my view. I think the Tartakovsky Clone Wars is not only much better, but is probably the peak of, I think, the EU, in my opinion. It's one of my favorite things from the Star Wars EU. Okay, having said that, I actually thought that the Tartakovsky Clone Wars would be silly. Ironically, I thought that the Filoni Clone Wars would be really great. And the reason is that the Tartakovsky Clone Wars was so different in a couple of respects. It was going to be this weird thing that was like these like little 3-minute installations on Cartoon Network, which were going to be really hard to even watch in real time. I mean, I remember being super excited when the DVDs finally came out, because you could just then actually watch the whole thing at once. But I remember, you know, a lot of the friends that I was living with, like in a apartment complex, like we would get together at different times, you know, when we would think it would be on. It really started to generate a buzz. It was really exciting. So you could try and catch it in real time. But that said, I mean, it was a big experiment, and I looked at the animation. I just didn't think it was going to work, and I was so wrong, and I'm so glad to be wrong. Now, that said, I remember, I guess it was like 2007 or something, whenever it was that there was the first sort of promotional push for the Filoni Clone Wars. I remember there was this poster, and I still have it, sort of like the first teaser poster from San Diego Comic-Con of the Filoni Clone Wars. And it clearly looked different. The animation style was different. But what's hard to remember now, what's hard to almost believe, is that it was being sold at the time as, in effect, a continuation, at least in spirit, of the Tartakovsky Clone Wars. I knew it wasn't going to be exactly the same, but I thought it was going to go and fill in some of the gaps from the Tartakovsky story, that it was going to be a continuation in that respect. And it really, really, really wasn't. And so that was a huge disappointment. So again, ironically, I I didn't have a lot of faith in Tartakovsky, was thankfully so wrong. Alternatively, the Clone Wars I thought would be great because I thought it was going to be like the Tartakovsky. Of course it wasn't. Yeah, I do, and that's a complicated question to answer in like a short period of time. I mean, one thing, I don't know if you know Evan Gamble. What is his name? Holocron Keeper Evan, I think. He's got a YouTube channel. He's done a lot of work, a lot of videos on how to make sense of some of the things even now, right? And he doesn't do it because he loves Filoni and because he's trying to make, but he wants to sort of see where we can sort of not engage in headcanon or anything, but just sort of try and make some sort of things fit. So that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. But I do think they'd be able to. The question is, would it be super satisfying? And I don't know, right? I mean, there's always like an infinite number of retcons and things you can sort of throw in there to make sense of it, right? But how sweeping, how big, how narratively interesting would they be is another sort of question, you know? I just think it's very regrettable that that we're in a position where we really need to fix it. We have to fix it, right? Because it is a mess. It is a mess, and I think that's just unfortunate. It didn't have to be that way. It didn't have to be that way, and I think that the biggest regret is, of course, the decanonization. Why? Precisely because it meant that we weren't going to get a fix anytime soon, you know, and yeah. And now we're in a really weird position where if you take the pre-2014 hierarchy of canon seriously, one of the very subtle but quick and easy ways they were trying to sort of begin to make it work was to sort of give it its own hierarchy level, right? It was T-canon. Well, now we're at a point where in theory, it trumps other things, right? Which doesn't make any sense, right? They were doing that partially, I believe, to say, let's offload it here for now. We'll make sense of it later. We can kind of reintegrate stuff. But it's a nightmare. They've made it a huge mess. And I don't blame tons of fans for just wanting to write it away, you know, write it off. I can't because again, it's like it was there since 2008. It's some part of it's got to make sense, you know. I think we would need about 15 more hours to sort of really dive into all the specifics, you know, about how to do it. But I think they would have been able to. The weird thing about the EU is that it was always able to make sense in the long run of things that didn't evidently add up, right? Classic example, obviously being like Boba Fett's origins, right? Attack of the Clones comes out, doesn't make any sense anymore. The EU is able to make sense of it. But there are lots of smaller things that would like come about. Some author would introduce this thing and then some other author would have to come and sort of retcon it and through like a little short story or whatever, right? So on the one hand, that's the real power of the EU. The only thing that has become come clear to me over the years is that I sort of feel like some of the needs for some of those fixes actually some of the problems weren't inevitable, right? Like someone really Leland G should have put his hand up and said to an author, no, you can't do that because we're going to have to then sort of fix it later. So I regret him not sort of putting his foot down harder. And I feel like what clearly happened in the case of Filoni is that he just was given carte blanche and he ran with that. So I'm a fan of both. Yeah, I'm a fan of both. I mean, I was a huge Marvel fan growing up, and I found that over the years that's just completely flip-flopped now. Where I will occasionally still follow Spider-Man just to kind of keep up in general with that storyline, but sometimes it's good, sometimes it's really not good. But I just think in general, yeah, DC, despite the fact that I think DC Comics, if we're talking about just the comic books themselves, DC Comics has for years just been so unsure of itself and like the constant sort of reboots but it still gets me, you know? So I think I'd say I'm more of a DC guy now when it comes to the movies. I'm actually not a huge movie guy, to be honest. And, I do think that the MCU has probably done it better than the DC stuff. Although, I mean, that said, I really liked some of the DC stuff. I was shocked how much I liked the extended version of Batman versus Superman. I thought Aquaman was just really entertaining. Shazam was kind of fun. I haven't seen the Snyder Cut, but I actually like Zack Snyder. But I'm a little nervous to see what happens in the MCU. But yeah, I'm a fan of both of them. I think I'm slightly more DC now. But I actually, back in the day, I was a huge Image guy, as many folks were. And it's interesting. One of the things that's definitely sort of like I've filled the void of having no EU with is like getting more into comics, you know. And I go through waves. I'm slightly on the verge of maybe walking away from comics for a little bit, just because the prices have just gotten crazy. It's like it's going to go up to like $5.99 an issue. It's not worth it. Well, that's a good question. Yeah, I know. There were a couple things that were coming, you know, and could have, yeah, things could have turned out very interesting. Yeah, I guess we'll never know. No, I haven't seen that. I don't have Disney Plus, so I haven't seen that stuff. So I've heard I heard good things about WandaVision, and I've heard that the Falcon and Winter Soldier get into some pretty sort of, it seems like they're adapting some pretty classic Captain America storylines from the 80s and stuff, which I'm really excited to see, because it sort of felt like just based on the MCU, that the movies, just that like they sort of felt like they thought they'd done everything with Captain America. It's like, great, they thought him out. He's this hero, and then he like passes on the baton to Sam. It's like, okay, well, there's a lot more there, right? And I'm just glad to see that they've done that. Interesting. Yeah, I think you answered my question for me, actually. I mean, basically, how would I have done it? I basically include the things that we know were going to be published that weren't, right? The most superficial sort of contradiction, for instance, being like, you know, wait a minute, how are Han and Leia about to get married, even though we know that another book, they know we know from the authors what they were going to do. And I don't know if you've been watching the whole time, but one of the things I talked about earlier was like, at this point, one of the things I think I'd almost prefer to see in terms of continuation of Legends would just be like having the authors just tell us what they wanted to do, right? Give us an outline, you know? So just tell us, like, so imagine the authors of that book just being able to say, look, officially speaking, here's what was going to happen, so that anyone has doubts, right, that Jedi Prince is, like, you know, not C canon or something, right? Here you go. Do I think Palpatine will eat Baby Yoda? I do not follow the new canon, and I presume that Baby Yoda is a character in the new canon, and so I do not have an answer to that question. But thank you for watching. Let's see. So back to my list of things that I thought would be bad that I thought ended up being good. One is the book Dark Lord: The Rise of Vader. That to me felt like there's a weird history with that book, James Luceno book. It was, I think, really, it was initially supposed to be something else. It turned into the book it is now. I thought that, particularly coming off as it did, only a few months, I think, like beyond the Revenge of the Sith, I thought it was going to be kind of like slightly lame, kind of media tie-in, right? Not cash grabby, but what real work was it going to do to advance the lore? And I think I don't know why, but that's one of the EU books that I find myself sort of rereading a lot. I don't know why. I'm not knocking it, right? Actually, clearly I like it, but there was just something about, I had extremely low expectations, and it ended up being better than I thought. And even though I know it's sort of like a retroactive sort of trilogy, like they've really tried hard to make a trilogy out of Labyrinth of Evil and Revenge of the Sith and Dark Lord, I kind of like it, you know, because those are three books that I really like. And it would be really interesting to sort of, I think a kind of like an interesting game EU fans could play would be like, what are like really good runs? Like, how many like solid runs are there? How many books are there that are all like great in a row, right? You know, before you get sort of a stinker and stuff like that. And I think that's a really interesting case where it's like, there's a nice run. It's like, you think of like a rock group or something having like, what three records in a row were just really great right before the spell was broken? I think Labyrinth of Evil and Revenge of the Sith and Dark Lord that's a good 3-book run that you can, you know, spend quality time with. The other thing, by the way, speaking of Revenge of the Sith, the other thing just in general is in the prequel era, I always had low expectations for the novelizations, and was always extremely pleasantly surprised. I think that I think the Revenge of the Sith is probably the best, although Phantom Menace is really good too. And Attack of the Clones is the only Star Wars novelization that I read before seeing the movie, because it came out, I forget at this point, a couple of weeks or so before the movie, and I just couldn't wait. And I'm really glad I did. I'm really glad I read it, actually, because there's little bits of context here and there that kind of helped out. I mean, the most memorable being like it. I was anticipating that like Qui-Gon was going to come back in some form, right? You know, when Anakin is like wailing on the Sand People. So anyway, that helped explain some of that, which would have been a little unclear, I think, in the movie otherwise, at least to me. Hey, that would be great. That would be interesting. A rated R little bonus for the next Blu-ray release. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Well, yeah, I totally agree. Bad titles. You know, there's some good titles. There's some bad titles. I think that I don't want to be accused of knocking on the new canon, but I will just say this: I can sense from osmosis, having spent a lot of time in bookstores. I don't read the new stuff, but you can clearly see it over there. It's very clear that the new canon has a lot of very simplistic titles, right? I mean, think about how many books are just simply titled after the character, and the EU started to do that in a slow way. You know, again, like with John Jackson Miller's Kenobi, right? It's like there was surely a better title than just Kenobi and stuff. So there's some rough titles out there. I also think there's some really bad covers. I don't think the EU on the whole has great book covers. That may be a controversial opinion. There's some really good ones, but there's few peaks and a lot of valley, in my opinion. But yeah, I think that's generally true. My favorite EU books. I don't want to hedge too much here, but I will just say this: that I think this, because this can get really controversial, people's opinions about these sorts of things, right? Because I have some fairly lame opinions about some of my favorites are kind of weird, actually. But I like to break this into 3 different parts. I think when people ask this, I really wonder, do they want to know what do I think is objectively the best versus what are my favorite, which could be my favorite for a variety of like personal nostalgic reasons, and what are the things that I actually like, say, reread the most, right? And I think those 3 things could potentially all be different. So I think some of the best Star Wars books are things like Plagueis and the Brian Daley trilogy, and Star by Star, Vector Prime. I mean, there's a lot of really good books. My favorite, I've said this before, that people just die laughing because they think I'm being silly. It's Yoda Dark Rendezvous. And again, is that the best book? No, but it's a favorite of mine for just a variety of reasons. I think you'd have to be me to understand. Something about it. There's qualities about it that I think are helpful. There's contributions to lore that are important, but also I just liked being a Star Wars fan at that time when it came out. And so yeah, it's just always a go-to for me. In terms of ones that I reread the most, it's really odd. Like sometimes it's simply a function of like which books are, because I do reread a lot of them, which ones are like easier to carry around with me. So like if I'm in a period of time where I'm flying a lot, which I haven't been flying a lot the last year, not many of us have, right? But like Allegiance is actually one that I reread a lot because it's kind of a small book, you know, and I there's things about it I like. I think Allegiance was probably Zahn's last good book. It had promise, but anyway, there's other ones too. I'm trying to think which other ones have I read. Plagueis is actually one I've reread quite a bit because it's the only Star Wars book that I have on Kindle. So again, when I'm on an airplane, it's pretty easy to pull it up. Hey, thanks for joining. My thoughts on TCW. I actually just talked a little bit about that. Really, really quickly, I can summarize. My thoughts on TCW are that I think I like some of the episodes. I think that the show in general, very regrettably, makes a huge mess out of EU continuity where it doesn't need to. I also think that one of the most unfortunate things about the 2014 decanonization is that it deprived us of the opportunity to hold Lucasfilm's feet to the fire to give us the promised retcons that Leland Shee, as early as 2008, said he would give us. And so I think that the show, and I'll say this too, to be sort of super positive, I've seen the way in which it has been sort of a gateway drug into Star Wars for a younger generation. So it's got positives, right? Again, there's some episodes I like, but it pales in comparison to the Tartakovsky Clone Wars. And again, I just think that most of what Filoni was able to get away with, I think, is very regrettable. So that's that. I think a lot of it is retconnable, but I think we're going to need Lucasfilm's official help to make sense of some of that. And I think it's very, very regrettable the way in which I think the show has actually created this huge wedge in the fandom. And there's clearly way too much heat about the Clone Wars. It's a shame that EU fans, which can unite over so much, end up fighting over it. But again, I like some of it, and on the whole, though, I think it's the inferior Clone Wars. I'll just put it that way. Yep. I don't know, but a friend of mine is good friends with him, so I'd like to figure that out. If I find out, I will let you guys know. There's a guy I know named Mike Fessler, who folks should go check out on Twitter. I think he's only on Twitter. He's a really, really good guy and a hardcore, super knowledgeable EU fan who was actually working with James Luceno prior to the decanonization on a official Lucasfilm reference guide, Del Rey reference guide to the Grand Army of the Republic, the Clone Army of the Republic. So Luceno was working with him sort of behind the scenes to make that happen. Mike's a great guy. Check him out, Fessler, Mike Fessler on Twitter. Yeah, you can learn a little bit more about that. So he might have more to say about Luceno as well. I think that, yeah, in Dark Rendezvous, I think the insights into sort of getting to be inside their heads, I think is a very important part of that book. I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting too. Obviously, Dooku isn't going to, come back to the Jedi, right? But I think that the author does a good job of sort of at least showing you sort of like the internal struggle that Dooku has, right? I think again, I don't think it's the best book, but I think there's important things about it. Yeah, that's great. That's good. Yeah, I mean, I thought that the promise was really there. Again, people can argue about whether really he pulled it off or whatever. But in general, I mean, if all you did was, I mean, imagine being a Del Rey, right, or Lucasfilm or something. If someone comes to me and says, "Look, here's my pitch. I want to talk about some stormtroopers sort of late in the rebellion or late in sort of like the Empire, who they've seen too much. That's a story I would greenlight, right? I maybe would have written it differently. I'd be interested to see other people's takes on it. But yeah, I mean, I think again, it's a book with good promise. Absolutely. Yep. I think there's a lot of evidence for that. What do you think of it so far? Or are you rereading it? What did you think of it the first time? Because I know that's one of those books that's one of those series of books that I was surprised to find years later, with sort of like the rise of more fan forums and stuff online that was like not a fan favorite. And I guess I realized I'm just pretty easily pleased because I always really enjoyed it. But again, you got to remember the time where it was like, hey, you were only getting so many new EU books a year, and it really only constituted at that point only so much of an entire EU library. It was like, I'll just take anything, right? But I mean, anyway, I'd be interested in your thoughts. Yep, part of a long list of things on the wish list for sure. I like Luceno in general. I mean, I'm trying to think. I mean, I like Luceno, I like Denning, and I like Stover. Now, I think all of those authors have a book or two that some fans aren't all huge fans of. I mean, it seems like some Lucino fans like aren't super keen on, like, I don't know, Cloak of Deception. And I think Matt Stover's work, again, I think I highly praise it for a variety of things he did, including Shatterpoint, Revenge of the Sith novel. But I know a lot of fans aren't a huge fan of Shadows of Mendor. But I think that there's, I do like that book. I think that I like some of the homages I think he's making, some of the old early sort of EU Brian Daley stuff. Yeah. That is high. I'd say that's probably in my top 5 all-time wish list of things I'd want to see. And I think it was a strange sort of gap. I mean, I appreciate that we knew that they weren't supposed to do a lot on Yoda in general. So it was a big deal that Yoda Dark Rendezvous was commissioned. But yeah, I mean, that's a huge missed opportunity. It's really surprising. And I mean, I'd be shocked if folks didn't try and make the pitch for it back in the day, you know. But what else here? What else is on my list of things I thought would? So yeah, you know what? Going back to this sort of thing I mentioned. So it's like, anytime someone says, "What's my favorite?" of something, and I think really it's like, no, it's really a question of what do you think's the best versus what is your favorite versus what are the things that you sort of like rewatch or reread. I mean, when I really thought about it, like just taking the movies, I was amazed to find that I probably think the best is probably, I don't know. See, this is tough. And I think it changes, right? I think it changes just like all the time, you know. What's my favorite movie? That's a tough one. God, why is it hard to say? I think Return of the Jedi might be the best, but just for the throne room scenes. I think my favorite is probably, that might be my favorite too. But see, the thing is, the one that I've rewatched the most is Phantom Menace, go figure, right? So it's just funny how I think breaking it down in those 3 different ways can really sort of reveal completely sort of different answers. Totally right. And yeah, absolutely. And I kind of hesitated before because that's the thing I hear all the time and I completely sort of agree with. In fact, it's funny. I haven't seen Last Jedi, the movie, but what I hear is that it's sort of all over the place. It's like super convoluted, right? Multiple sort of like seemingly never intersecting subplots and stuff. And I heard someone compare that to that bit of Black Fleet Crisis, and I go, oh, I get it now. That makes that makes sense. Yep. Yeah, you know, God, I'm inspired to go figure out what Lucino's up to. There's another guy who I would love to know what he'd been planning. It's interesting. Right? He's one of a small group of EU authors who ends up writing early on in the new canon, because I think he did, what was it, like the prequel to Rogue One or something. And I don't think he's really done anything sort of since, but it's like, what would he have done? What sort of ideas in that book would he have been able to, what ideas did he have for that book that he was maybe keeping for what would have been an EU book, right? I'd want to know that. You're reading Jedi Academy, so you want to know what books to read so that you can then go on with NJO. Oh man, gosh, is it okay just to say every book before them? There's not that many when you really think about it, the grand scheme. If you just read every Bantam book. Gosh. I also wish I had the benefit of my book collection behind me, which I don't. But I mean, yeah, finish that. If anyone has any thoughts, drop them into the chat or whatever. But gosh, I'm gonna be a jerk and say read everything in the Bantam era, and only because I think you get the most value. Here, I'll put it this way. If you didn't read anything, you just started with Vector Prime, I actually still think you'd be fine. I just think you'd miss stuff, right? So again, there's a question of what's essential. I think you're going to be fine whatever you maybe sort of skip, but I think there is such an amazing value to me in reading the EU in publication order. I've gone back and forth about this over the years, not entirely what you're asking, but about what's the best way of approaching the EU. Is it through sort of chronological timeline order or publication order? And I think publication order, because it's just, you subtly see the ways in which authors are building on, even if their stories aren't connected in timeline, they're building on new ways of thinking about Star Wars. And I think the interesting thing, and this is maybe the most sort of core reason why I think there's value into reading all of, say, the main adult novels prior to NJO. It's that you can sort of see the way in which NJO, how do I put this? It's like NJO comes, X number of years after many people get into, it comes about 10 years after like the Thrawn trilogy, just in publication order, right? Because 91, when did it come out? 2000, I forget exactly when. There were tons of EU fans who were, like teenagers, whatever, right? Sort of like being introduced to Star Wars for the first time, or the EU with the Thrawn trilogy. And those books are good, they're classic, right? But like, I think they would have been written differently there. Then you read a couple, how do I put this? It's like, there's a couple books that come afterwards that they sort of, in retrospect, feel kind of silly and superficial. And you read Crystal Star, and it's once again, it's about a silly sort of space alien. Could have been a Star Trek book, almost was one. The twins are getting kidnapped. It just feels like silly, contained adventures, not super adventurous, right? It wasn't really supposed to be. It was just supposed to sort of put out a little bit of Star Wars here and there. 10 years later, those teenagers, they've grown up, right? And guess what else grew up? The EU. And the NJO it's like a recognition that the franchise has grown up right alongside you, right? So it's kind of cool to get that contrast, right? It's like you appreciate just how much more serious things are. Just when you think you're tired of reading about like, the twins getting kidnapped again and all these silly little one-shot Bantamera books, then you go, oh, okay. That's because that's for me when I was 12. This is for me when I'm in my 20s. You know what I mean? So anyway, that's my long-winded answer. Yeah, Thrawn. I hope you've read Thrawn. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely essential in Jedi and the Callista stuff. And yeah. Well, Hand of Thrawn. That's definitely the book to. That's definitely the book to finish things on for sure. It's funny. This is a while back. I was saying how I was slightly skeptical of the NJO for a variety of reasons. As a fan at the time, wondering, is it going to be the same? Is it going to feel the same? There was a movement of people, some of whom still exist, who believe that Star Wars and the Star Wars EU, they're hardcore EU fans. It's just that what they believe is that the EU should have ended with the Hand of Thrawn duology, that provided enough of sort of a closing chapter on the sort of the final sort of post Jedi story. So there's people who view Star Wars as basically existing from the Old Republic right up to Hand of Thrawn. Well, there is Invasion is technically sort of part of that timeline. But if you haven't seen that, definitely do check that out. But if you mean like just like the entire thing get adapted, sort of like kind of get retold in comic form, I think that would be great. I think it would be great. In fact, boy, it would be a massive undertaking, but that would be an amazing sort of HBO Max miniseries, right? I agree with that. I did, but not really in any way that I could sort of technically like call myself like, but not. I did, like I played it, I think at someone's house type of a thing. Just unfortunately didn't, right? I was kind of like, I was the nerd that didn't play the games, but just wanted to sort of read the stories. My only interesting connection though to Jedi Knight 2, well, the second one is it was actually developed where I live, right? So a couple of blocks from where I'm sitting at Raven Games, and so that was cool. So there was a lot of Star Wars stuff that came out of there for a period of time, and this guy Jeffrey Moy, Moy, was the artist at Raven who was tasked with basically sort of like coming up with sort of like helping to visualize the game, right? That he would then give to the programmers to sort of make sense of. So I've gotten to talk to him here and actually get some of his like unreleased, produced production art for different scenes of that game. So it's like kind of like quasi sort of canon to the EU and to Jedi Knight 2. So that was pretty cool. So he's got a website where he shares some stuff. It's really worth looking up. Jeffrey Moy, M-O-Y. I wish I did play this stuff, by the way. And there's a really interesting movement afoot, not only through limited run games, which is sort of putting some of the stuff back out, which is really cool, really exciting. But there's a really neat movement afoot attempting to capture all of the old EU video games, right? Because it's way more than just the old console games or even some of the online RPGs. There's tons of things that maybe like old like Flash games that like won't even run anymore on most people's websites and stuff. So there's a YouTube channel, and I gotta look it up. I'll share this at some point down the road. That's trying to gather up sort of like screen shares of all of this old stuff, because some of it is going away forever. It's really sad. It'd be really sad to think that at some point someone wouldn't be able to get back into some of these older games. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, definitely. I only the weirdest thing to me about some of this though is that I know there are people who are in the sort of the movement to continue the EU who are also of the view that the EU should have stopped at some of these earlier points, which I always found sort of baffling. I think their view is that they want a continuation of the EU, but only sort of like pre Hand of Thrawn or pre sort of NJO and things like that. So more power to them, but it's kind of funny. It's interesting how those people existed. Again, pre-2014, there were people who were just hardcore advocates for the idea of there needing to be an end, right? And then post-2014 are kind of like, well, whatever, I'll join this movement to continue the EU, ironically, because I want to continue parts of it, And I've often said this, if the EU came back tomorrow, immediately the fandom would just once again break apart the way it really was pre-2014, where people were like fighting about nerdy little things all about the EU, whatever. Right now, we're all still kind of united. No one really needs to pick a favorite era, right? In the way that pre-2014, people had favorite eras, You could kind of pick and choose. As I said earlier in the stream, I didn't, the Old Republic stuff, I never rushed to it. I always picked it up, but I never felt the need to rush there, right? I think my favorite era was always post-Jedi, wanting to know more. That's why I love the Bantam era so much. But it's also why I desperately want to, understand the gap between Crucible and Legacy. It's funny, Matt Wilkins has told me, and it's compelling, right? When it comes to the mess that is the Clone Wars timeline, thanks to the Filoni Clone Wars. And let's be fair, there's a couple of things that the Tartakovsky Clone Wars, there's a couple little things here and there that like don't entirely add up, that again are totally regrettable, right? But like his view, it's so interesting. He's kind of like, look, yeah, it's a total mess. The Clone Wars is a total mess. We need a whole bunch of retcons. It would be great if someday Lee Lin-Chi actually fulfilled his promise to give us those. But in the meantime, it's like, look, what does it matter? We know that the Clone Wars happened and that they end, and what matters is like stuff that comes later, right? So it's like we're not going to learn something new, fundamentally about like what happens post Clone Wars. Once we figure out, how many times in reality Dooku and Anakin actually fought before Revenge of the Sith. But it's a compelling point. I understand where he's coming from. It's a nice way of just sort of like trying to skirt the issue because it is so divisive, understandably. It is funny. I like the Legacy stuff a lot, actually. And I think your PS is totally funny too. I totally agree, and I would love to know how why it died. It's interesting that I guess it's the only formal confirmation we have that one of the big three is dead, right? I'm trying to think, like, I mean, obviously Han and Leia don't live all the way into the Legacy era, right? And neither would have Luke, but yeah, I'm trying to think. My ideas aren't very interesting or very original, but it is fun to sometimes think about how the big three would go out. And I think that, and I feel like I'm probably just parodying Matt Wilkins here, who I'm sure has said the same thing, but I think that it would be great if Luke goes out kind of like, maybe like Yoda, where he kind of just fades away, but I think it would be kind of cool too if there was some sort of sacrifice, sort of a la Kenobi, right? Where he's able to sort of do so in front of some, Padawan or something, right? And I think that Leia, I think it would be interesting if Leia, it would be kind of interesting to see her go out in a blaze of glory too, like fully initiated Jedi. But then again, I think like maybe she goes out in some sort of more regal way. It would be a nice sort of poetic sort of like way of giving her death, like, I don't know, like the calm and peace that her mother's death didn't get, right? But then like, I think Han unquestionably has to die along with the Millennium Falcon. I just think that those two need to go out at the same time, so. Do I think Lucas considers it to be canon to his canonical 6 film universe? That is a very, very challenging question to dive into for a lot of reasons because, gosh, but it's a good one. It's an important one to talk about. And I sort of think that, I think what Lucas says about the EU, oh God, this is controversial, okay. I'll say a couple things in no particular order. My own view is that the interesting thing about the EU is that in some ways it doesn't matter what George thinks about it, right? And that what the EU's job always was to continue to tell the story, right? And to just continue to make sense of the films and itself in the context of the overall Star Wars saga. So whatever George thought or didn't think about it, the EU could meet the challenge, right? Again, Attack of the Clones, George introduces a seeming and confusing series of contradictions to the Boba Fett story we knew from the EU, but the EU comes along and makes sense of it, right? So whatever George thought about the EU's canonicity or its existence doesn't matter, right? Because the EU is almost bigger than George, right? Bigger than the films. So that's sort of one take, right? So again, I think it's an interesting case where EU fans can kind of have their cake and eat it too when it comes to George, because I think that George says enough about the EU over time, both explicitly and implicitly, that we know that he thinks that we know his views about the EU. We know he supports it. He kind of got it started. He does things. He regards it in lots of ways. He pulls stuff from the EU into the films and things like that. But at the same time, we can have our cake and eat it too. We can recognize that and also say, yeah, but like it doesn't really sort of matter. So okay. So the other thing I'd say about George and just anything he says about anything is that George is all over the place on so many topics, right? Depending on what day of the week, what he had for lunch, how grumpy he is, he'll say one thing here and the next day something else, right? And so it's really easy to play this game online where people sort of like cherry pick quotes he says about anything. You can find him contradicting himself all over the place about all sorts of things, right? He contradicts himself about how many films he ultimately wanted to make. He contradicts himself about, about the EU, the canonicity of it, a whole range of things, right? I think it's clear that he definitely wanted to move into more TV. I think like, how do I put this? He's kind of like the head of a board of a corporation, right? Who maybe like once a year spends 20 minutes coming to the annual board meeting. And it's like, okay, yep, I see these reports, right? Is the president and CEO doing their job? Okay, great. We don't need to fire anyone. Okay, right, we're going to re-up you. You get to do your job again for the year. I'll see you guys later, right? Unlike Hollywood and TV, like board people don't sit around and like actually do the work, right? I think George was a little bit like that in Clone Wars. And I think it's like, I do think he thought this is going to be sort of like, yeah, like I want to be involved in this. I want to help produce this, right? He's not involved in the day-to-day, but like he thinks it's more or less sort of part of the story, right? Where I think, though, that it goes off the rails is that I think it's like there was still Lucasfilm who was there, should have been doing a better job sort of saying, look, like, no, some of this stuff doesn't make sense. It doesn't feel right. Yeah, George was in the room yesterday, and he said, because, we know from the DVD commentaries, there are things that Filoni's doing that, like, even George said not to do. George wanted Ahsoka to die, which would have been amazing. I think super heroic and fascinating and narratively bold and everything like that. But so I'm rambling here, but like, what do I think he thinks about it? On the one hand, I sometimes choose not to wade in those waters because it doesn't matter. But I think that he may think that it, it's pretty canonical to his films. But here is the thing that wouldn't make sense if that's true. If that is the case, why didn't he ever go back and stick Ahsoka in Revenge of the Sith or something, right? That is one of the weirdest things about the Filoni Clone Wars. And I think you kind of hit at this here. I've always wondered the sense has contradictions with the movies and overall tone atmosphere. That's the thing, the tone atmosphere. There's something about the world of the Clone Wars that doesn't feel like the vast majority of Star Wars that came before it, right? And this is one reason why I think that it's maybe the only reason why I think understanding or following the EU in publication order, so to speak, doesn't make sense. It's because what that would effectively mean is that you're going to read basically everything published from 1976 all the way up to about 2008. And then the last couple of years of published stuff is going to be predominantly Clone Wars-ish and stuff. There's going to be other things in there, right? But you're going to get a number of seasons of this cartoon show. With Ahsoka, you're going to have spent 40 years almost of a saga and then walk away thinking that the entire point of Star Wars was to focus on this, this loser Padawan who walks away from the Jedi Order. It doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense that she doesn't come up in Revenge of the Sith. You know what I mean? So that part of it feels very weird. And I think that the Clone Wars, given what it wanted to do sort of separately from what we know of as like the established Star Wars stuff, I think greatly benefited by coming after the films and things like that, because it sort of felt like, oh yeah, we've done all that. We can do something new, right? But it forgot where it was in the context of the overall saga, which was just really regrettable. The most satisfying EU novel to read. Plagueis was satisfying, yeah. Plagueis was definitely satisfying. It was satisfying. I think Plagueis is a good one because it was years in the making. It wasn't always supposed to be the book that it ended up becoming. It is a solid book. You learn a lot. It's extremely well written. I guess the proof's in the pudding. I've gone back to that quite a few times. I do find it very satisfying. You know what? If I knew that or heard that, I guess I'd forgotten it because I don't know. That's interesting. You know what? That's a fun fan theory. I had no idea. I need to look into that. What do you think? I know that'd be interesting. That'd be kind of neat. It would be neat to think of some version of an EU story, even well beyond Legacy, 500 years into the future, where there are the droids or some version of them, right? Some version of some part of the sort of the Skywalker sort of saga that is able to live that long, right? That's able to sort of tell like sort of the future tales. That would be really kind of neat. What else to talk about here? What else? Gosh, how long have I been going? I appreciate everyone hanging in there, watching along. An hour long. Wow. Okay. Yeah, I am. I'm interested in it all. It's funny. I just I'm so mad. I actually Are you interested in EU promo material for non-English speaking countries? Yeah, I am, because I'm so bummed. I try not to get tons of stuff off eBay because it's sort of, I don't know, it's like the fun's kind of in the hunt, right? Kind of like going to different like trade shows and different collectors things and like finding their stuff there. Obviously, given the state of the world, not many opportunities in the last year to go to conventions and stuff. So I've been spending more time on eBay trying to find some obscure stuff that I know exists that I bet will be there or whatever. So, oh man, I got just totally sniped recently. There was this Japanese collector who seemed to have like everything, every promo item you can imagine. And there were a couple of things that I didn't even know existed because they were just for the Japanese market. Some really cool, there was one really cool thing, really early piece, a really cool poster with mostly Japanese text, but sort of highlighting some of the earliest Dark Horse comic trades. Really, really neat. Also had this massive like 4-foot banner from Bantam, must have been from around 1991, promoting sort of the existence of this new line of Star Wars books. And I came so close to getting it, but got sniped at the last minute. And now I'm just like, oh man, now I just want to get out of the promo game altogether. But no, I mean, I look for it everywhere. I've got a bunch of stuff I actually have a bunch of stuff in French, both because of France and also because there's a ton of stuff, ton of promo material from Montreal too, or just Quebec in general. Like I've got some great stuff from the Tartakovsky Clone Wars that's in Quebecois. Really cool. I've got this like amazing, it's literally the size of a bus shelter, and it's a poster for the Tartakovsky Clone Wars. So yeah, I've got a ton of promo stuff from Germany, actually a lot of video game promo stuff from Germany. There evidently is like a really strong like German EU game market. Maybe Quality Autism can speak to that, but like I've got stuff from like Masters of like Terrakasi in German, and like Rogue Squadron and KOTOR and SWTOR, a ton of really interesting German things there. Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, it's a good question. Disappointing. I don't know that I was ever a super just thinking of like the main sort of like books and mainline comics and stuff. I don't know that I was ever super disappointed. Let me see here. 1 second. Getting a text here. So I want to say disappointed, but I will just say things maybe to live up to expectations. This is a controversial sort of opinion, I think, but I feel like Kenobi is a book that is so highly rated among fans that I feel like I'm now finding myself just like almost by default on the other side of that. I like it. I didn't think it was the greatest thing I've ever read. I didn't think it was the greatest EU book out there. It's good, but the way people talk about it, like it's, I don't know. I think that I was disappointed a little bit in the Invasion comics. I think it just sort of missed. I think the timing was very unfortunate. I think that I'm kind of reinterpreting your question. I've become increasingly hesitant about recommending, say, people read the Thrawn trilogy first because it was everything it needed to be in 1991. I don't think it holds up that well anymore. It still has the feel of the old Star Wars, but I don't know. And to my earlier point about the NJO almost being like growing up along with the fandom, I feel like the books got so much better. So I think there's some early stuff that sort of like in retrospect maybe feels disappointing. But other comics too, I'm trying to think. It's weird. I don't have many hot takes because I'm like pretty easily entertained, honestly. And I'm amazed. The last 10 years has been fascinating. Like the more sort of like the fandom is able to sort of meet one another online and forums and stuff, I'm constantly finding people saying things like, I hate Black Fleet Crisis. And I'm like, oh really? I didn't know people felt that way, right? Or it's sort of vaguely my sense that like people are not like massive fans of like, I don't know, Dark Times or Empire. I love those comics. I just do. I just really enjoy them. So I don't know. It's an interesting question. I'll have to think more about that. I'd be curious on your thoughts too. And it's funny, in a way, this goes back to like a really early topic here that I mentioned like an hour ago, which is like this was going to be a topic of a stream last week with Matt Wilkins. And the really challenging thing was partially because at this point, 7 years on, I'm having a hard time remembering what my thoughts prior to reading this stuff were, right? And so that's been part of the challenge. I kind of just remember what I think of it now, you know. But I've been rereading a lot, you know, and I've been trying to go back and reread the EU in publication order effectively, and so that's been interesting. I've been finding how different my views are now in retrospect, you know, but particularly with some of the earlier stuff. Oh, that's cool. Well, I think I might have to go back to work. So anyway, I want to thank everyone. There's still 5 people here. Thank you so much for hanging around. I'm really glad to have gotten to talk to folks. So thanks for doing this. Hopefully I can do this a little bit more often. And yeah, hopefully you guys can join me. So thanks a bunch. Have a great rest of the day, and may the force be with you. How corny is that? Talk to you later. I always do this. I always leave the live stream, but forget to actually end the broadcast and take it offline. So silly me. Anyway, thanks a lot, guys. Talk to you later. I always do this.